Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our 12th installment of this course. I'm Mehrotra, a volunteer with the Breach Collective, and I'm thrilled to be moderating this conversation about a feminist Green New Deal in the UK and US. I'm joined by Mara Dolan and Dr. Frances Roberts-Gregory from the Feminist Green New Deal Coalition, and also Maeve, Cohen, and Dr. Sherilyn MacGregor, who co-authored a paper for WEN and the Women's Budget Group about a feminist Green New Deal in the UK. Though this will mostly be a conversation, Maeve and Sherilyn will start us off with a brief presentation, and then Mara and Frances will also talk a bit about their work. So please feel free to drop questions in the chat throughout the conversation, and we'll get to them after their presentations. So I'll turn it over to you, Maeve and Sherilyn.
Great, thanks a lot, Shree, and welcome everyone. It's lovely to be joining you. We're over in the UK, so it's 8 o'clock at night here. It's been a long day, so we're going to be super informal with this. We don't have a PowerPoint. We're just going to talk about, or just give you a kind of an introduction to the work that we've been doing. Maeve and I have been working together for about a year and a half now. Looking at, working on what a feminist Green New Deal for the UK would be like. And that involves writing a blog for Open Democracy and then a policy paper. And then this year we've updated it, looking at doing a kind of draft roadmap to a feminist Green New Deal, which is helping to drive some policy discussions and roundtables running up to the COP26 in Glasgow, which is being hosted in the UK in the autumn. So as Shree said, the work that we've been doing has been sponsored and commissioned by two feminist organizations in the UK, the Women's Environmental Network and the Women's Budget Group. And our process really involved critically analyzing, like starting from a position of critically analyzing existing UK versions of a Green New Deal, which go back to around the time of the financial crisis. And some think tanks started to think about what a Green New Deal would look like for trying to recover from the financial crisis. And over the years, this has kind of been developed, taken on board by various left-wing think tanks in the UK, as well as the Green Party and the Labour Party. And of course, at the moment, there's a cross-party bill before Parliament to have a green industrial strategy for the UK. So our analysis really was trying to look at that critically, and to do so, we needed to develop a framework for critically trying to understand these proposals from a critical feminist perspective. So we developed a kind of framework that involves gender justice principles taken from feminist scholarship, as well as really the essential ingredients that we've found in other feminist Green New Deal versions. So we've been really influenced by the amazing work that's being done by the global feminist climate justice movement. Of course, we do, and the work that Mara and her colleagues have been doing. So we really owe a great debt to their work. And I think their efforts are much more advanced than ours. We're still trying to bring more people into the conversation. We're trying to contribute to what's becoming a very early kind of developing coalition of different groups in the UK. But again, just to stress that we don't have the same kind of coalition, broad-based coalition of grassroots movements and organizations in the UK that you've probably seen in the US. So, so yes, as I said, there's a few other groups that are working in the UK to set out what a Green New Deal would look like. And we feel that while they do offer discussions and concerns and principles around social justice, we don't think they go far enough to address specifically feminist concerns and goals. The environmental movement in the UK has sort of, traditionally not been very attentive to feminist politics. So our main criticisms of what we've seen already developing in the UK is that it is a very elite-driven process, crafted mostly by policy experts and think tanks who are not representative of the population. It says very little about devolving power to citizens. We also think that it has a very narrow focus on greening while growing the economy and creating a certain type of job that's mainly in green technology, digitalization, energy, construction, sort of the physical infrastructure that has a particular, that draws in a particular type of job and economic development. There's a lot of masculinist assumptions that are kind of rooted in orthodox political economy within these existing Green New Deals, very narrow understanding of what economy is for and what a green agenda actually looks like. And we think that they fail to challenge gendered social structures and stereotypes, or even to demand a change to those gendered structures and stereotypes. So Maeve is going to give some examples of some of the recommendations that we came up with, but I just want to touch really briefly on some of the essential ingredients that are part of our framework. The first one is that intersectionality has to be central to a feminist Green New Deal, and intersectionality has to be mainstreamed into and embedded in all policies and actions. I'm sure most of you here know what the concept of intersectionality is, so I'm not going to define it here, but we think that it's a really important policy tool that should be used to try to counteract the ridiculous situation where the interests of a whole society have been sort of defined around a very narrow life pattern and experience. And certainly in the UK, the whole Green New Deal is kind of patterned or sort of, designed to meet the needs of educated, well-off, able-bodied, cisgendered, hetero, white men and women. So this is a fundamental element of trying to get towards a feminist Green New Deal. The second is an analysis of the deep connections between intersecting inequalities and environmental destruction. And so we've looked at some of the work by feminist ecological economists and ecofeminists, looking at the sort of deep structures, deep connections between all of the major forces that lead to ecological destruction, climate crisis, and all of the social inequalities that are causing a crisis in our societies. So we think that essential to a feminist Green New Deal is to understand these root causes and to really try to shift the thinking that takes hold and grows, rather than being so that we can sort of really embed these ideas rather than just giving lip service to issues to do with gender equality and other intersecting inequalities. The third and final ingredient is that the gender division of labor and unequal division of care, the feminization of care, needs to be centered in this approach. So the Women's Budget Group has done a really good job at producing evidence and research to support the idea that care inequalities are a real driver of gender inequalities. And so we think that in a feminist Green New Deal, we need to sort of develop policies, recommendations, and approaches that redesign, restructure the economy so that care work is valued and is seen as low carbon and extremely, foundational to any kind of egalitarian and green society. So those are our main principles in our framework. We can talk about some other recommendations and some examples in a group discussion, but Maeve's going to touch on some of the key ones that you might find interesting. Maeve.
Thanks, Sherilyn. First thing I'm going to say is apologies. I will try and speak as clearly as possible, but I think some of you will be a bit lost on my accent. So do ask questions, even if it's just like, what did she just say? And hopefully Sherilyn can like translate for me. But yeah, so I'm just going to draw out three of the sort of main messages that are in the paper. There's a lot more in it than this, but I think these are the three of the most important ones. And the first one that Sherilyn alluded to is this idea that care jobs are green jobs. So we challenge the idea that when we frame green jobs at the minute, we think about men in hard hats building wind farms or solar farms, retrofitting houses, creating green tech and things like that. And we want to challenge this. And if even just from like a really narrow employment perspective, we need to start talking about and recognizing that if we want to achieve the dual aims of environmental sustainability and social justice, then we need to be creating a lot more labor-intensive, low-carbon jobs. And that's exactly what the caring industries are, right? So care jobs are green jobs, even in this narrow sense, but also when we're thinking of creating a socially just world, then obviously the caring industries need to be front and center. These industries are dominated by women and by marginalized groups. And so improving life for people that work in the caring industries improves lives for these people. And also by creating fulfilling and rewarding jobs, we want to attract more men into the caring industries to sort of rebalance the gender inequalities there. And obviously this needs to go hand in hand with increasing representations from underrepresented groups in the main industries of transport, construction and tech that we always think of when we think about green jobs. So that's the sort of driving message that we wanted to give in the paper, that care jobs are green jobs. Another thing that we think doesn't get much airtime and needs to be considered a lot more with a Green New Deal is that a lot of the technologies that have enabled women to enter the labour force they're not green technologies, right? So if we do away with these technologies in the name of remaining within our planetary boundaries, then we need to think about how the additional labour that'll be created by getting rid of these technologies can be distributed more fairly. So I'm definitely going to get this quote wrong, but Sherilyn taught me. I was doing a political economist master last year, and she was my lecturer. And the quote was something like, if we're going to live in this utopia where we fish in the morning and philosophize after dinner, there's never any mention of who cooks that dinner. And I think that really demonstrates how little gender considerations are put in this sort of green utopia that we think about. So to give you a concrete example, there's a big push to ban single-use plastics, right? And that's great. We do need to stop consuming so much single-use plastics, but this lack of convenience that is caused by using single-use plastics will cause additional labour. So, for example, it means no disposable nappies, so diapers, no disposable diapers. So that's going to increase the labour needed in childcare considerably. And we need to think about who's going to do this work. So one of the ways that we think about this in the paper is, instead of, that work falling on the heads of women, we can think about this as a positive thing, because it means creating more opportunity for local, sustainable micro industries, creating well-paid, socially and environmentally stable employment. So rather than putting that labour unpaid on women and marginalised groups, we can create industries around this additional labour that's going to be created when we get rid of these technologies like single-use plastics. Another example would be ready meals, so like microwave meals. The agro business, the general food industry causes something like 26% of all carbon emissions. It's incredibly carbon intensive. So it's absolutely fundamental that we move towards locally grown organic food. But obviously that's going to create additional labour. So it's going to be food preparation and processing that isn't happening now in big factories. It's happening in the home. And we need to make sure that again just doesn't overburden women again. So this is another opportunity to create local cooperatives, community-owned businesses that can provide these services, provide these food and laundry services to local people in an equitable way. And then the last point that I wanted to pull out of the paper was that living sustainably and justly also requires a transformation of our built environment. So the way that we build our towns and cities is incredibly individualized and based on this like nuclear family norm. And we don't obviously we don't all need our own individual cars, we don't need our individual washing machines or like suite of recycling bins and so on. The collective provision of many of these things is far, far more environmentally friendly, sustainable. When we're placing the burden of decreasing our carbon footprint on individuals, at the same time as having this built environment of these towns and cities that are built on a model of individual consumption, it just doesn't make any sense. So we need to radically rethink how we design our public and private spaces. But obviously, as everything, these transformations must consider the gender implications of any change. So again, to give a more concrete example, our transport systems are going to have to change dramatically. So we need a huge increase in public transport networks and a rapid reduction in car use. But we also need to think about what the impact of getting rid of cars is going to be on caregivers. So people who are required to make multiple small trips a day, so doing the school run or going to the shops, going to get groceries, going to the doctors, things like that. The people that use these services have to, which is women and marginalised groups predominantly, they must be included in the design and the delivery of these services. When thinking about housing as another example, we need to move towards the collective provision of things like laundry services, kitchens, gardens, spaces where children can play safely. And we need to move away from this model of private luxury that we're currently in to one of, for the few, to one of public abundance for everyone. And that whole idea underpins the fact that this move towards sustainable living doesn't mean that we have to give up a good quality of life. It means we need public abundance rather than private abundance. And lastly on this, a for-profit model is not adequate when delivering fundamental services such as transport and housing. So what we need is locally and collectively provided, democratically controlled and controlled services, and these need to be facilitated by a supportive state. So that's not necessarily being provided directly by the state, but the state must ensure that everybody has access to life's essentials. And this is particularly important when we're thinking about gender equality, as women use these services more than men. And when we think of things like social care, childcare, education, these fundamental services, when they are not provided in a sustainable way, then it's women that end up picking up the slack for that. So yeah, I'm gonna leave it there.
Thank you so much for the discussion of your work. I think it's really interesting that a lot of people in governments are thinking about how climate change disproportionately impacts women, but they're not thinking about how climate policy, as currently being talked about, is disproportionately impacting women. So really appreciate your work. Now I'd like to turn it over to Mara and Francis to talk a little bit more about what's been happening in the US.
Thank you, Shree. Hello, everyone. My name is Mara. I use she, her pronouns. I'm just setting a timer for myself really quickly so that I know when I need to shut up. I'm really thrilled and honored to be here. I am a huge fan of Power Shift and the Breach Collective, and was really excited to see that there's this interest in doing this really sort of broad-based movement education around sort of all of the different facets of what a transformative agenda that goes by the name of the Green New Deal to some folks for people and planet can look like. So I also just want to thank Sherilyn and Maeve for their interventions as well. I just graduated from school last year, and I was always reading Dr. MacGregor's work, and I feel like I'm back in school and kind of miss it, to be honest, a little bit. And I also, of course, read a lot of Francis's writing at the time, who has, I think just this last year, received her PhD. So congrats to Francis, and I also feel really fortunate to work closely with Francis in the FemGND, now Dr. Roberts-Gregory. So I'm just going to give a quick overview as to sort of what the FemGND in the US is doing, where we have been, how we came to be, a little bit of an origin story. And then I'll pass it over to Francis to give more of an overview around our principles, what we sort of think of as our organizing anchor the values that hold our coalition together, as well as speak to some of the work and focus that our coalition is also doing around this intersection of care and climate. So lots and lots of synergies with folks across the pond in the UK. So the FemG&D in the US, which is our shorthand name for the Feminist Green New Deal Coalition, came to be in really the spring of 2019. So if folks remember, this feels like ages ago, although it really was quite recent. When Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Ed Markey first introduced the Green New Deal resolution in, I think, February of 2019, it was a 12-page document, really kind of a skeleton outline of what this transformative agenda that would meet the climate crisis at the scale that science and justice demand, what kind of a roadmap of that would look like. And I think in that moment, there was obviously a lot of momentum and excitement from folks in the climate justice space, but also some apprehension around the ways that the Green New Deal as a vehicle also had massive potential for co-optation, and that there needed to be folks who were in the room pushing for the boldest and most transformative agenda that would really put racial, economic, and gender justice at its core. And so I think in that moment you saw a lot of folks turning to their partners in movement and saying, how can we really pose the kind of intervention that we need to in this space to ensure that not only legislators and sort of folks in the policymaking sphere are listening to us, but also that folks in movement understand and are on the same page around what we mean by a Green New Deal and what we're fighting for when we're building mass movements to push for this kind of policy agenda together. So one of those conversations that really started to emerge was among feminist organizations who had deep relationships in the global justice space. So there were 6 or 7 organizations who had longstanding relationships and partnerships, mostly around COP, the Conference of Parties, which is the UN climate negotiation space, where there's much I could say about this, but it's a space where gender justice has been fought for by a broad coalition of global feminists for many years. And there were a lot of lessons to learn around the ways that transnational feminist movements need to push for global justice within each of their national climate conversations as well. And that was a lesson that these US-based feminist organizations really took to heart as well when folks in the US started thinking about what bold US climate action needed to look like, knowing that climate policy is not just domestic policy. There is no such thing as domestic climate policy. All climate policy really is global in nature. And if we don't have global justice at the core, we're just going to be building nationalistic climate policy. So those groups came together in the spring of 2019 and started to think through what a collective, co-generated feminist intervention in this moment could be. Really not sort of assuming that it would take any certain form, that we would even become a coalition, but instead really thinking about sort of what is a short and powerful intervention around feminist principles that we can turn to, disseminate, point folks to, that really can guide conversations around the Green New Deal in a more feminist direction. And so knowing that I think for many feminists, the product, it's not just about the product being feminist, it's also about the process being feminist. Over the course of that summer, those groups really convened a series of consultative calls with hundreds of feminist individuals and groups around the country and globally to really just call on folks to share what they considered feminist principles or feminist values that a Green New Deal should hold. And so over those 3.5 months, and I think the timing of that was key, it really needed to be a process that was not rushed, in the sense that there were lots of frontline folks. There were folks who are on the front line of fighting pipelines and who on the front lines of many sort of environmental and climate justice resistance movements that, there are so many ways that the that the culture of urgency, which is white supremacist at its core, is also shutting out folks who are leaders in the feminist movement and leaders in the climate justice movement. And so often our coalitions are moving at paces that are not inclusive. So I think I'm really proud of the fact that though it took us 4 or 5 months to really co-generate these principles, there was a reason for that, and that reason is feminist process. So in the fall then, those principles that came together from an incredibly messy Google Doc of hundreds of folks' contributions were consolidated into 10 core principles. And Frances will touch on those 10 core principles in a moment, but I'll just end by saying that really after those principles were finalized and the folks who were a part of that process were energized and I think really moved and heartened by the spirit of collective ambition and clarity of focus that those principles communicated, made clear that they wanted to do more with those principles and do more with mobilizing those principles into movement education, into policy interventions, and more. And so thus the coalition was born and folks endorsed the principles and signed on as members. And we began a process of sort of moving forward as a coalition with a structure of working groups and folks who are focused on different aspects. So happy to move into sort of talking more about that in the moderated discussion, but I'll pass over now to Frances to share a bit more about what these principles are and what some of our focus as a coalition is on right now. Over to you, Frances.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Mara, for that great overview. And also, I'm so excited to be a part of this conversation. Such phenomenal thinkers and organizers and activists on this call. So a bit about, I actually wanted to first mention a bit about how I became involved with the Feminist Agenda for a Green New Deal Coalition in the United States. So in, I want to say the summer of maybe it was the spring of 2019 as well, I was presenting at the World Forum on Climate Justice in Glasgow, Scotland, and I was invited to join the Feminist Agenda for a Green New Deal. And this really spoke to me because as a feminist political ecologist, my own research looks at feminist environmentalisms, ecofeminisms, and also how women of color in Gulf Coast, Louisiana, and the United States really navigate contradictory relationships with energy and petrochemical industries. So I was really excited to join this transnational, really eco-feminist collective. And also I was excited to see that some folk that I deeply admire, such as the Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy, also endorse the principles. So a bit about our principles. So if you haven't already read them, I definitely encourage you to visit the feministgreenNewDeal.com. As Mara mentioned, we have 10 principles, and they include, ideas that many of you are familiar with, such as, the need for intersectional gender analysis, like, intersectionality is key. Also, as Mara mentioned, the idea that domestic climate policy is connected to transnational climate policy. So there's no such thing as domestic climate policy in a silo. We can also talk about the need to confront institutional patriarchy, racism, also the need to advance reproductive and gender justice. And this is also, I would say, key because a lot of times folk think that gender is synonymous with women, and that's not true. We're talking about gender justice, reproductive justice for folk from all different identities, all different types of bodies. Also the need, we're really passionate about centering Indigenous people's rights and leadership. Many of our members are folk from frontline and fence line communities, Indigenous women who are water protectors. So we wanna definitely center their leadership. And then I would lastly just say that we really emphasize the need to confront exploitative and unsustainable production patterns, ensure democratic community-led solutions, and respect youth leadership and reject false solutions for the climate crisis. And so I'm sure many of you are also familiar with this idea of the need to get away from geoengineering or carbon capture and, even like cap and trade, these market-based initiatives that don't really get at the core of addressing gender-based violence, gender-based inequality. I'm also really excited to note that many of the members of the Feminist Green New Deal Coalition actually pivoted to focusing on care and climate, similar to our colleagues, as Mara stated, across the pond, and actually created a feminist COVID response website. And so I definitely encourage you to check that out as well. There's, I believe, 6 principles that focus on what are feminist perspectives on a equitable and regenerative COVID-19 recovery. And in addition to devising these principles, many of my colleagues also created a feminist monitoring and advocacy toolkit where you can actually monitor many of these policies that are developing in real time and get a better understanding of how they can impact you and your local regions. And then I'm really excited to mention that a few weeks ago in April, is May now, our colleagues, Dr. Lenore Palladino and Rihanna Gunright, who, as many of you may or may not know, is one of the policy architects of the Green New Deal, created a care and climate brief. And this brief really is very similar, many synergies to what has already been stated, but just the idea that care work is gendered and racialized. We see women of color comprising the backbone of our care economy that is unpaid and sometimes paid, and mostly informal. Also, the idea that care work is invisible, it's unrecognized, that oftentimes this care work is segregated. There's occupational segregation. And also, as was mentioned earlier, there really is a need for equitable access to clean energy jobs, because when we talk about energy, our energy infrastructure, energy grid is the labor force, just transition is dominated by oftentimes of men, masculine bodies, often white men. And we want to actually change that if we talk about a just transition. And finally, I would say in this care and climate brief, we really focus on, as was mentioned earlier, the need to decarbonize care infrastructure, and this idea that there's going to be a greater need for care during this triple crisis of climate, care, and COVID. And that when we think about the devaluation of care workers, this goes all the way back to these plantation economies, which were also sexualized economies, and also goes back to New Deal policies in the United States, where, for example, Black women were excluded from fair labor standards. And so there's a long history of this racialized and gendered devaluation of care work. Finally, I would just add that our colleagues in the Feminist Green New Deal Coalition are really excited to promote the Thrive Agenda, or the Thrive Act. And the Thrive Act stands for Transform, Heal, and Renew by Investing in a Vibrant Economy. I believe this was proposed last week, maybe on Monday or Tuesday, and there's 8 principles of the Thrive Agenda. But really, we're getting at this idea of the need for public investment. Once again, this rethinking of green infrastructure as care infrastructure, and to just have an intersectional approach when we're building these new transit systems, when we're thinking about solar power, when we're restoring our wetlands. And so, yeah, at this point, I think we will end it here, because I definitely want to make sure that we have time for questions. And then also, don't want to forget to also state that many of our members are really excited about feminist economics, also excited about feminist foreign policy, feminist philanthropy, and are even thinking critically about healing justice, and are beginning dialogue with folk in feminist philanthropy to think about how do we support funding and grants for activists on the front lines who are dealing with activist fatigue, burnout, and also how do we promote post-traumatic growth, because there's a lot of critiques in academic and activist circles of resiliency, but we do want to make sure that there's healing involved as we imagine feminist futures. So thank you so much.
Thank you for that introduction. So both groups talked a lot on, touched on a lot of topics. And so I have a bunch of questions that kind of pull on a lot of these themes. And I think I first want to start broad. Part of the reason we invited both groups is because climate change is inherently an international issue, as you all were talking about, and it requires thinkers from around the world. And so I thought it was cool to bring a different perspective, as a lot of our speakers have been from the US. during this course. And I thought it's particularly interesting, the term Green New Deal, because I think Mara talked about the co-optation of the Green New Deal and making sure that everyone in the movement is on the same page. And I think that's a big theme in this course, in terms of hearing from different perspectives and how there's a lot of different policy briefs out there and different priorities and principles, like Francis was just outlining, that a lot of different groups have to focus on different marginalized groups or different needs for their communities. But I think it's important to engage in this cross dialogue about that. So I first wanted to talk about, what does the term Green New Deal represent to people outside the US, and why they've chosen to use it, like in Europe and the UK. Also, I'm noticing now it seems more palatable in UK political circles than in the US right now, just politically. And so it'd be interesting to talk about that with all of you.
Yeah. Well, I think the first Green New Deal paper that was put forward in the UK, yeah, it was in 2007. So with an economist called Anne Pettifer, who I'm a big fan of, and Andrew Sims and Caroline Lucas, who was the head of the Green Party at the time, and some Labour MPs. So it's been in the sort of political discussion for quite a long time. So in policy circles and think tanks, and I think it's certainly on the progressive left, policy heads on the progressive left talked about it a lot and have been talking about it since then. But it really was AOC over here that really sort of lit a fire under it. And then I don't know how closely you guys follow British politics, but the Labour Party up until the last election was led by socialists, by explicit socialists who were very pushing a really progressive left agenda, and that was a big part of their manifesto, and it was a big part of the manifesto of the Green Party, who's a very, very small party in the UK, but not so in Europe. Many European countries have much larger Green parties. So I think it's been in the political discussion for quite a bit longer, and because one of our two main parties was shouting about it quite a lot, I think there is quite a lot of to use the horrible term brand recognition, but quite a lot of brand recognition. People know what it is. Yeah, I don't know if you've got anything to add to that, Sherilyn.
Yeah, when you say people know what it is, I would say a certain slice of British public knows what it is, and it's not a very big slice. So I think it is a fairly elite concept. And I think at the moment, some of the other things that are being used is build back better, and that's becoming a bit of a buzzword for people that people are coalescing around, again, to sort of think about how you recover from, this notion of a just recovery or a just green recovery, which I think is also getting maybe more traction than the Green New Deal. I don't know, amongst sort of a broader spectrum of the population. The only other 2 points to say that the European Union call it a Green Deal. They take out the new, I think possibly to not have that connection to the American, the first New Deal. And the other final thing is that amongst the women's budget group, who sort of started this whole process of us working on this off, they brought up the point they don't even like the term feminist Green New Deal, and they now want a new name for it. No one can come up with a better name, but they actually don't like it. So I don't know where it's going.
And just in fairness to the Green New Deal peeps over here, like that critique that it's too elitist is taking hold, and there is now an organisation called Green New Deal UK who are bringing together a lot of grassroots community organisers in the UK and trying to sort of rebuild the concept of the Green New Deal in a more inclusive way. But that is very, very new, but very welcome.
Yeah, I can't speak to how the Green New Deal is being understood in the UK, but I will say that as part of the global justice focus that I think the FemG&D in the US and the UK share, one of the things that our coalition did in the fall was, and I think that as Sherilyn and Maeve talked about, hoping to do some of this work perhaps in the lead up to COP26, or when folks can convene in person again, is actually create space where global feminists who are organizing and gathering around these frameworks, sometimes they go by the Green New Deal and sometimes they don't, can really come together to talk about the synergies and strategies that they implement and how they can learn from each other. So in the fall of last year, there was a really large sort of virtual gathering that both Sherilyn and Maeve were at, that the FemGND and our partners in the UK and many of our partners who are organizing for global feminist climate justice, even if they don't necessarily use the term the Green New Deal, met and had like a 4-hour virtual forum and conversation in breakout rooms where we listened to like 6 or 7 different regional groups present their frameworks for feminist global climate justice that looked slightly different in different regions around the world, that had different strategies based on the lived realities of different governments and statuses of mass movements in their spaces, and what felt like priorities or possibilities for their movements at that time. So each of these frameworks looked slightly different, but it was really beautiful and useful and generative to come together and talk about what each of those frameworks had to learn from each other. And I think one of the things that came out of that conversation for me was really thinking about the ways that the Green New Deal as a framework doesn't necessarily work everywhere, at least in the ways that it's being conceptualized by like AOC and Markey as a piece of legislation. So I think one of the things that we're seeing right now is this tension between sort of the Green New Deal as a piece of legislation, which, as I said, is like a 12-page document, and then the Green New Deal in the imagination and the vision of movements who are really putting together something that goes far beyond 12 pages in terms of the depth and the breadth of the kind of society that can be made possible through massive and serious federal investments in social services and in good dignified jobs and in racial and economic and gender justice. So I think, one of the things that we're coming up against and that we heard on that town hall in the fall was that, I think globally, a lot of the things that folks hear around the Green New Deal in the US is that it's really based on this idea of a just transition. And of course, the idea of a just transition comes from Indigenous organizers, labor organizers, folks who are really thinking about how to move from an extractive fossil fuel-based economy into one that is care-based and non-extractives based, and also doesn't leave behind workers in that process. And so folks who are, for example, coal miners are not left behind in that transition. And that framework of a just transition doesn't necessarily look the same in every country, right? Not every country is sort of seeing the same economic reality that the US is of a coal industry that is dying and renewable energy that is on the rise. Different countries are in different spaces in terms of the ways that extractives and their economy and labor are sort of in relationship with each other. So I think part of what's challenging but also really exciting is that the Green New Deal can take on different forms in different spaces. And though we might see sort of in the US this huge focus, which I would also say is really propagated by the right-wing media, around like seeing the Green New Deal as just a thing about coal miners or a thing about meat and like banning cows and airplanes. There are ways that I think the Green New Deal as a conversation will take on different forms in different spaces, and is an invitation for movements to sort of make of it what they will in terms of just being shared language for a transformative agenda, though that may look different in different spaces.
Yeah, and really quickly, I would just add that when we talk about Green New Deal policy platforms, obviously we see like in Britain, many of the European Green New Deal policies in the 2000s, but also we see Green New Deal policy platforms are just parties in like Germany and Korea. We also see folk from like the global South associated with the United Nations who are also promulgating some of these ideas. And then also I would say many of these ideas that have coalesced into these Green New Deal policy platforms actually are from the 70s, 80s, 90s. And, you know, they were developed and inspired by the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and also, you know, ideas of European ecological modernization, and even like critiques of the international climate negotiations. So I think it's unfortunate that the US kind of monopolizes this conversation on the Green New Deal, but there's antecedents in different geographies.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I thought it was interesting how you talked about not only how there's Green New Deal policies and across the globe, but also Mara said there's different frameworks that work in different places, and it may just be the reason that a Green New Deal may not have picked up in other places is just that framework isn't really as relevant to that specific region. So I think it'd be interesting to talk about what you think are the differences between a feminist Green New Deal in the US and the UK, if you think that there is any difference, and also how do you think it would differ in other countries, if you have any examples or just broad thoughts about that.
I think one of the major differences between the UK and the US is we have a welfare state. So the social justice angle hasn't been hammered home as much in the UK as it has been in the US. So because we have free healthcare at the point of use, because we have, much better unemployment support and the rest of it, though it is getting worse and worse and worse, the concentration in the UK, and because the Green New Deal in the UK came out of the financial crisis, was a lot more around finance and the role of finance in sort of fueling carboniferous capitalism, or for want of a better word. And it was looking at the sort of, Francis just talked about the triple crisis of care, COVID and climate. They talked about a triple crisis of finance, inequality and climate. That was what it sort of was around in the UK. So I think there's been a big difference, and the UK's had to do a lot of catch up thinking about the social justice angle, because it's very much been all about just decarbonising the economy.
Yeah, and I would just add, so that's the kind of policy framing. I think from the sort of angle of social movements, I think there's a real difference as well. I think the UK environmentalism is very narrow. It's very white middle class. It's not very. We don't have an environmental justice movement, or we haven't until recently, an environmental justice movement to speak of. We're not a settler colonial country, therefore the kind of engagement with the really important, insights from Indigenous activists is we don't have that. There's now much more, awareness of the role that racial justice and climate justice are absolutely intertwined, but that's very, very recent. And there aren't very many prominent activist voices from many, many different, movements, many different social justice movements in the UK. So we don't have that reflected in the discussion. So I think even Maeve and I trying to do this work, we feel very much on the, we almost feel, we're very much trying to, play catch up and emulate what's been going on in other places. And as I said, there's a lot more to be done to build coalitions here.
I think it's just to really hammer home that point that Sherilyn made about the environmental movement in the UK is incredibly elitist and incredibly wide and incredibly middle class, to the extent that people don't want to associate. And I think there's been a massive barrier to this, the sort of groundbreaking work that was done in the UK with XR is that's an example of how that was really groundbreaking. And it was all just middle class white people who could take work off for 2 weeks and go and lie in the middle of the roads in London because they were in such a privileged position. So it really is a huge issue, the elitism in the environmental movement in the UK.
Francis, do you want to take a stab at this one first, or would you like me to?
You can go first.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I really appreciate both of those. And I mean, I would say Maeve, same. That's a huge challenge in the US as well. I think I want to say in this as well, kind of pushing back on the framing a little bit of the question, Shree. I want to be careful to say that, like, I do not mean to say that the Green New Deal as a framework is not relevant to some places. I think what I do want to hammer home is that movements and folks who have been fighting for environmental and climate justice in their own spaces and communities for generations are able to determine which frameworks are most useful and generative for their own work. And so the Green New Deal is that for some folks, but other frameworks and other ways of pushing for change are more generative for others. So I think, for example, of one of the groups that presented in our frameworks town hall, and I just stuck the reader in the chat if folks are interested. And these are some of our partners in the Pacific, Diva for Equality, which is a queer feminist grassroots climate and environmental justice organization based in Fiji. And their framework of Women Defend the Commons, which is in this reader, and folks can feel free to dive in to learn more. They're an incredible organization who I think have been really transformative and formative for me in understanding my orientation towards global feminist climate justice, and I know for many others the same. But a lot of their work revolves around having these localized hubs that are meeting community needs around clean air, clean water, clean food, and land rights in a way that feels very akin to mutual aid and the conversations that have been really gaining a lot of traction around mutual aid, at least here in the US this year, in the face of the pandemic, in the ways that the economic crisis has really been impacting folks, and communities are turning to each other to meet their needs. And so I think, there's ways that when I was listening to Diva for Equality present this framework and talk about the ways that for them climate justice and the ways that they're pushing for climate justice in their communities is so localized and about meeting folks' needs by turning to each other and really seeing what are the resources and the ways that we can support our rights to clean air, clean water, and food for all in our own spaces. And then also think about, in tandem, what are our sort of broad policy goals and demands and advocacy strategy for our government, but also then for the world around the climate reparations, for example, that we know as a small developing island state that we are owed. And I think that framework looks very different than, for example, what the Feminist Green New Deal Coalition is doing right now. And we have a lot to learn from that. And so I think for me, it's really about doing this, like this cross-pollinating work of understanding what are the ways that our frameworks can learn from each other, and not about saying that the Green New Deal as a framework should work everywhere, or if it's tweaked a little bit, maybe it'll work everywhere. I think there are ways that movements can embrace aspects of the Green New Deal that work for them, and push the Green New Deal to be something else if they want it to be, which is, I think, what I'm seeing in the US and what I take a lot of hope from. But I also think that I don't want to ever see the Green New Deal in its current sort of iteration or understanding in the US as like an end all be all for all spaces and people and places, because I certainly don't think that's the case. And the Green New Deal in its idea, as Frances has spoken to already, comes out of the visions for generations of Indigenous organizers and of grassroots feminists and folks who have been making these same demands around what a climate just world looks like and what peace and sustainability for people and planet actually demands of our governments. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like everything's been said, but I agree with everything that's been said thus far. I would just add that when we talk about the Green New Deal, I also want to complicate this idea, although I'm guilty of it, of like the US versus like other places, or that comparison, because actually the Green New Deal is going to look different in different localities in the United States, because the US is not a monolith, and the global South exists in the global North. And so I would say that for me, it's really interesting to think about how, like in Louisiana, we have folk advocating for a Gulf South for a Green New Deal and creating like a policy platform for like Gulf states, which is really important because this is a region that's home to it's dominated by fossil fuels, petrochemical production, plastics even. Also like folk on the ground who are thinking about a red New Deal or a red, black, and green New Deal. I think that's pretty interesting to see different visions for that even within the contiguous United States. And then I would also say that I think that I'm actually really inspired by a lot of the Green New Deal of work going on in Europe. And so I feel like in a lot of ways, as mentioned, is cross-pollination, but also I think there's a learning curve for folk here in the United States as well, since we don't have like necessarily that same social support system. We don't really do that. And I think finally, I would just add that I think for me, as someone coming out of environmental justice, the Green New Deal in the United States has a lot of connections to this long history of environmental justice. And I found from some of my international colleagues that environmental justice is an international framework, obviously, but there's folk who might prefer terms such as environmentalisms of the poor, folk who maybe are more focused on like circular economies, and then also folk who perhaps aren't so focused on, who are focused more on like radical grassroots strategies because the state might not have the same policy infrastructure. So in the United States, we have this robust environmental policy infrastructure, but not all nations, all states have that same infrastructure. And a lot of that is due to the fact that we outsource our pollution to other geographies. So it's definitely going to look different in different places, but I think there are a lot of synergies, and I'm excited to see folk in the United States get more involved in the international climate negotiations, because I do think that sometimes in the US, we tend to think about the sustainability issues from a regional perspective and from the governance structure of like the United States, and we don't always respect or engage with these international negotiation spaces, which other countries rely on more heavily due to these power inequalities. So yeah, I'm excited to see these global solidarities evolve and grow.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm also really excited that you talked about kind of how the US outsources its pollutions, and so kind of makes you think more about what our commitments are to other nations and other people. And I think that's kind of a similarity between the US and the UK, although it's in different ways that they've impacted certain nations and people. And so I wanted to talk a little bit more about how you think the US and UK's environmental foreign policy perspective or commitments impact what your recommendations would be for a feminist Green New Deal, or what considerations we should be making. I know we talked a little bit about climate reparations, so any thoughts you have on that?
Maybe I'll start us off here by saying I'm excited to say that there's going to be a new brief that is going to be coming out from this is a bit of an aside, but essentially there's this big moment that's happening this year called the Generation Equality Forum, which is this large global process around sort of gathering member states of the UN around a global agenda towards gender equality, building on the momentum from the Beijing Declaration 25 years ago. And one of the themes there are 6 action coalitions. One of them is climate justice. And the organization that I work for is one of the co-leads. And we are releasing a brief in the next couple of weeks that is around the principles for what a decolonial global feminist Green New Deal would look like, and sort of in an understanding that with like 10 or so pillars, 6 to 10 pillars, there are ways that shared advocacy language around sort of the clear changes and shifts that member states around the world need to make is really key, because again, the Green New Deal is not something that that if a Green New Deal is achieved in one country, then global justice is achieved. I think that there is a real focus in the US right now, particularly from our coalition, in thinking through all of the ways that we are failing and that we need to shift policy norms to really meet the moment in terms of what the US owes the rest of the world. Last week, we saw Biden release, or was it 2 weeks ago? Oh my gosh, time is fake. Release the nationally determined contribution for the US. And though it was lauded by a lot of US climate groups for being bolder than Trump or Obama's administration, obviously, it was nowhere near what climate justice organizations who really are advocating for global justice know that we need in terms of meeting our financial obligations to climate finance funds, and not just the obligations, but really stepping up in leadership in terms of acknowledging and owning and knowing that the US is responsible for a quarter of the world's historical emissions, and that has huge consequences for what our role needs to be in terms of financing and supporting a transition to renewable energy around the world and supporting countries who are on the front lines already of climate impacts. So I think just to say that there's a lot of exciting work being done around sort of what broad global financial pillars need to be in terms of like really demanding key changes in climate finance architecture and also like global tax architecture. All of this is like very economics heavy, which I am not an economist. And so I tend to just be like, there's an exciting brief coming out that you should read, instead of being the person who writes that brief myself. So that's exactly what I'm doing right now. And I'll be sure to share that when that comes out. But I think there's a lot of exciting work being done around sort of particularly thinking about the US and all of the advocacy that needs to happen to put money where our mouths are in terms of what climate action looks like for us domestically, which we know needs to be globally focused.
Yeah, and I would just add really quickly, I mean, just 3 things that come to mind, which I think I mentioned earlier, just as Mara mentioned, feminist economics, like that's really important. Folk thinking about how do we rethink these tax codes, how do we rethink GDP, all of that. Feminist philanthropy, which we see examples of new and the like global green grants, and we have in the US the High Fund for Climate and Gender Justice and Frida, so many different individuals. But yeah, that's really interesting to think about feminist philanthropy, especially since there might be some new feminist philanthropists due to recent divorce proceedings. And then also I would say feminist foreign policy is something that's really exciting, which I'm also not an economist, but I'm excited to learn more about what our colleagues around the world are dreaming of and thinking of. So, yeah.
I would, I think it's nice to hear things being exciting over in the US. At the moment, I don't feel they're very exciting here in the UK. I don't have a very well thought through answer to this, but I would say that, the last government, when the Labour government was in power, the idea was that the UK would sort of lead by example, and so we're the first country to have a binding climate legislation, so the Climate Change Act from 2010, and so that was kind of our leading by example and doing some very progressive things to get our own emissions and contributions to the global climate emergency under control. But since then, things have not gone very well, and we've had a Tory government in power now that have just continuously eroded and gotten cut foreign aid, cut aid budgets, doing a bit of a Trump approach to foreign policy. So it's not a very bright picture here. So in our feminist Green New Deal policy paper, we really tried to focus on the need to think about how the UK would, repay debts, heal harms caused by the UK's colonial past, as well as its racist and misogynist present, by finance, development, and military and care service sectors, and really things like the UK's involvement in neo-colonial international relations to do with tax havens, offshoring, and militarism, like major, arms manufacturing and trade is a major thing that the UK is involved in. And there's not enough of an outcry by the climate justice movement or the Green New Deal supporters in think tanks and so forth of foregrounding those issues, I don't think. I don't know if you have a view on that, Maeve.
Well, yeah, I know, I agree with everything you say, but just to be a little bit more positive, there is some good news in the UK. So we do actually have a really thriving group of organizations who work on green finance and trying to green, and it's all, I mean, anything finance related is going to be a bit elitist, but I'm a non-executive director on an organization called Positive Money, who have had some major wins. And well, the biggest win they've had recently was even within this Tory government, who are, I mean, I can't talk about them for too long because I get too upset, but the Bank of England has now the mandate of central banks is really, really narrow and is basically about keeping inflation below a certain level by setting interest rates. The Bank of England is now going to include green targets within their mandate, and that'll have a huge impact on what the Bank of England can do, who the Bank of England can finance, what loans and bonds the Bank of England can underwrite. So it is a massive win for organisations working on green finance, and because the City of London is such a centre for global finance, it will hopefully have repercussions around financial institutions around the world. So that is a really big win, and it's been years and years and years of really thankless campaigning by organisations like Positive Money. But just to add to what Mara was saying about green finance in general, I think we really need to start challenging the basis of green finance. I know that lots of organisations do this, but things like carbon offsetting and how these mechanisms that are supposed to green our financial systems and green our economies are actually just serving as transferences of wealth from the global south to the global north. And when stuff goes wrong and the shit hits the fan, the finance just rips out of these countries, and they're burdened with loads of debt and with loads of projects that no longer work or don't achieve the carbon offsetting that they were supposed to when they were set up. So there's a whole area of climate finance that is, the deeper that you get into it, the more depressing and worrying it is, and how embedded financialization and finance is within our economies is truly scary. And I think that in the UK in the 1980s, we had Margaret Thatcher, who was our Reagan, and her one job to get the economic system that she wanted was to smash the unions and smash the power of Labour, and that was how she was going to get neoliberalism to have a foothold in the UK, and she did that. I think our counter challenge to that now is to smash finance and to smash financialization, and we are not going to get the justice that we need if our financial structures continue to exist in the way that they do. But it's a big old challenge.
Thank you for that. I want to turn to some audience questions. I want to remind everyone if they have questions to put in the chat box, but I'm going to read off Nick's. We are having a similar discussion around infrastructure investments in the United States, with the left arguing for a much broader understanding of infrastructure that would extend to all sorts of things that hold communities together, while the center and right are trying to insist that we should only be considering roads, bridges, physical infrastructure, like you mentioned before. Do you have any advice for us as we try to fight for more expansive interpretations of infrastructure to include a care economy?
Well, I just have a really quick thing, and we have it referenced in our paper, is that certainly the one sort of argumentation or sort of argumentative strategy you could use is to try to quantify, or in some ways provide quantitative evidence of what the difference between investing in a construction-led or physical infrastructure construction-led recovery versus a care-led recovery. And the Women's Budget Group in the UK have done that research and have the numbers to say that investment in green jobs, compared to construction-led recovery, building back from the COVID-19 pandemic through investing in care would create 2.7 times as many jobs and produce 30% less greenhouse gas emissions. So something like that, with some good evidence and quantitative kind of figures to go with it, I think is a pretty good strategy, for one thing.
Yeah, I agree with Sherilyn. Like, some folk are swayed by facts and figures, numbers, quantitative measures. So I think that's actually really helpful. I would maybe just add that in thinking long term, I would focus on like the education pipeline. I hate that word. But yeah, I think we need to think of education policy as climate justice policy. And so we need to ensure that we have more critical environmental literacy in our K-12 curriculum and our higher ed curriculum, because those are the folk who are our future voters, hopefully progressive voters. And sometimes folk who are stuck in their ways, I don't know, I'm a little like, I don't know if we can change their minds and hearts, but I think that we can like empower the youth who already actually are usually in alignment with our values. But yeah, I think that's one way to get more folk, because I know for myself, like before I joined this coalition, I never thought critically about care work. I did, but I didn't. I definitely wasn't thinking about it in relation to green infrastructure. So I think there is an education component and, you know, political conscientiation that's important.
Yeah, I echo all of that. Y'all are brilliant. I would just add that, you know, as the FemGND started thinking about what kinds of interventions, specifically from the policy working group, we could make around care, we totally were inspired by the Women's Budget Group report, and we're like, okay, let's think about what could be useful along these lines in the US. And the issue brief that just came out that Francis spoke to earlier, another piece of that work that folks who were involved in sort of the formulation of that brief made very clear was that in addition to that like policy wonky piece that is like, what are the policy intersections between policy and care? It would be really useful to have a piece that focuses more on building strong narratives at this intersection and really thinking about what sort of the core messages that our movements are saying are telling, the stories we're telling and the messages that we're propagating that really like push this intersection to the fore. And when we're thinking about like what climate investments and what climate action looks like. So like what Maeve was describing earlier around sort of like, when we think of green jobs, we think of men in hard hats, et cetera, et cetera. It's like, what are the ways that we can tell a different story at this intersection of care and climate? That means when we say green jobs, people also might think of a teacher or of a person who is a caregiver. And so there's an organization in the US called Data for Progress that many of you are familiar with, who do really incredible polling work. And there is a piece in the work right now from the FemGND that is doing polling around narratives at this intersection. So things like care work is green work, care jobs are green jobs, care infrastructure is infrastructure, climate investments are care investments, these kinds of sort of broad hooks that we can build then entire sort of messaging things around. So I'm thinking about, you know, the 30-second adverts that we put out around what climate action looks like when politicians are running on the Green Deal. Are they showing visuals that are just, you know, men in hard hats, or are they showing that they're like climate action and as a climate candidate they are actually like supporting care workers? So all of these pieces that are like what the story the public hears about the Green New Deal can be informed by this stuff around sort of what is landing and not landing and how we need to push stronger narratives at this intersection. So I hope that this report that comes out with this polling information around sort of what messages are landing with folks and also where additional work needs to be done to sort of flesh out these connections in order for, you know, your everyday person who is hearing care jobs are green jobs, for them to really buy into that and know that that is true and understand what that means for the candidates that they're supporting and whether they want climate action, et cetera. So I would say that narrative piece is huge in shifting that conversation around infrastructure, and hopefully something that this piece that we're working on right now can feed into as well.
Yeah, I think I totally agree with what you're saying, and I think that now is a perfect moment for it. Certainly in the UK, and I'm sure in the US, care is front and center in political discussions in a way that it hasn't been in my political lifetime. I've never seen it. We had, for weeks and weeks during the pandemic, everybody came out of their house on a Thursday and clapped for NHS workers, which was just like phenomenal. It hasn't translated into policy. When the Chancellor released his budget a few months ago, there was no pay rise. Well, there was a 1% pay rise, which is lower than the rate of inflation for NHS staff, and no investment in social infrastructure whatsoever. But the public mood, people are thinking about and talking about care and realizing how central care is to everything that we do and how we all depend on care. Like, obviously people who are depending on care immediately know that, but the rest of society can kind of forget about it. But at the minute, we're all sort of in this moment where care is front and center. And I think now is exactly the right times for new narratives like Mara's talking about. And yeah, for really, I think that pushing the sort of message that social infrastructure is just as important to a well-functioning economy as physical infrastructure. And due to mass underinvestment for decades and decades, you get more bang for your buck. I think these messages are getting through, and I was like, obviously there's loads of problems with the administration in America, but the fact that they're talking about social infrastructure, the fact that the president of the United States of America is talking about this stuff, is a huge shift in consciousness, and a huge, the fact that he said that trickle-down economics doesn't work. Like, I think we really need to celebrate these wins, because it is the narrative that's important. And if you've got the president saying this stuff, that stuff trickles down. The money doesn't trickle down, but that sort of change in the concept of what the economy is for and what the economy can do really does.
Yeah, I completely agree. I've also been really excited to see it more at the forefront of the conversation. I know the American Families Plan doesn't go as far as we need it to go, but it's exciting to even see that as being a core part of like a presidential platform and the conversation. I just also want to say, like, I'm really excited that care work is being discussed, because it kind of intersects a lot of my interests. I studied environmental science and also volunteer for the National Organization for Women. And my current work is with people with disabilities and their legal rights. And a lot of what I do involves direct support professionals and care work, and kind of how that's a failing industry right now, because people are not being recognized for that work and being paid minimum wage for really difficult jobs that require a lot of time and a lot of expertise. And so I think it's just the beginning, but definitely very exciting. And now I want to also turn, Nick has another really interesting question. In terms of relevancy and communication strategies that can support organizing for a Green New Deal, what do folks think about including messaging about police violence / carceral state and the massive investments in those sectors as a way to show distinctions between violence and care economies?
I guess, like, I think that we need there's multiple publics and multiple audiences, so we need multiple communication strategies. And so I think thinking about incarceration ecologies is a definitely important strategy for certain individuals. It's not going to sway everyone, but it will sway some individuals. And I think that's also really interesting, because within, like, EJ communities, and at least in the United States, I don't want to speak for other geographies, folk are thinking a lot about prison ecologies in relation to environmental justice, and how that's the front lines of climate justice at this point, particularly when we talk about privatization of prisons, and also the siting of prisons on brownfields and Superfund sites and just very toxic locations. So I think that could be that could sway some folk, but once again, I would say there's multiple audiences, and I think we need to take care with our to ensure the messaging is appropriate for the audience. And in general, dialogue is, and multi-directional dialogue is best, and as a communication strategy. And also humor. Humor is really important because all of these issues are pretty scary.
I would just add, I feel like here I really take leadership from the Movement for Black Lives in the US, in that I think their frameworks for broad-based policy agendas do wonders at sort of integrating an understanding of what sort of massive divestment from one space and investment in another, meaning divestment from like institutions and norms that are harmful, particularly to Black folks, but to all folks, and investing resources in communities, health, education, social services, the things that we need to sustain ourselves. And their sort of broad framework for this that you'll find tons of resources on their website about is just by shorthand, divest from harm, invest in care. And then that is broken down within each of their policy agenda tables. So they also have, for example, the environmental and climate policy table that is putting forth this red, black, and green New Deal that Frances talked about earlier. And the divest from harm and invest in care framework in that space looks like really naming the ways that divesting from institutions of harm includes policing, militarization, as well as fossil fuels and polluting industries. So the same way that that divestment from institutions that are killing us through poisoning us are also killing folks through police violence, those institutions can no longer have public state investment sustain them and really bolster them and allow them to continue to wreak havoc on Black folks in particular. And an understanding of really moving away from this like scarcity mindset that there just isn't enough resources for us to invest in care the way we need to invest in social services. It's like, no, we're just investing like billions of dollars in the police and billions of dollars in upholding white supremacy through this military in the US that nobody needs, and this police institution and incarceration that nobody needs, and is actively destroying communities and killing folks. And it's really about a redirection of what we understand as valuable, and where our investments and where our state investments need to be. And by state investments, I also mean like our tax money, like the value that our communities are creating. Where are we directing that? We need to be directing it back into our communities. So I think that, yeah, the messaging is absolutely integral in terms of understanding the intersections between social justice broadly and climate justice. And I think in particular, the divest from harm and invest in care framework that the Movement for Black Lives really spearheads is really useful in thinking through this.
I really agree with that. I think, yeah, it's just this. I'm really interested in how this stuff plays out now, because we were told there was no money pre-financial crisis, and then they found all this money, and then we were told there was no money after the financial crisis, and then they found all this money. And in the UK, we're being told there's no money, whilst in the US they found all this money. So I think this narrative that there's no money, that we can't, I'm obviously I don't believe it, but I would like to see if the public believe it. We'll see how it unfolds. So it's not even a choice. It's not even a choice between should we put loads of money in like incarcerating people, or should we put loads of money into care? We can do both. Like, obviously we shouldn't be doing that, but that whole narrative around there not being enough money, I think is going to fall flat this time round. And I think that what you were saying as well, Mara, about how we value things and how we think about value and where our money goes is really essential to what the economy should be doing. So a really good example of this is the patents, the row about patents on the COVID vaccines. That money is public money. That's our money. We gave that money to those research institutions and they created the vaccine, and now they are making billions and billions and billions of dollars, whilst people in the global south are dying. India is in such a horrendous state. And this is how what we value, how we think of our own wealth, and how we think of our own involvement in creating wealth, and our entitlements on the wealth that is created. It's it's a really terrifying situation that we're in. I am hopeful that it's getting so ridiculous and so blatant, the corruption and the profit extraction and the environmental extraction, that hopefully ordinary people will start kicking off soon, and it won't just be us lot.
I don't think I can add much more to that, really. I won't even try.
Thank you for that. I know we're at time, but I wanted to give you all the space to say any final thoughts you didn't get to touch on, or anything you'd like to add.
I guess I'll start. I would just say, once again, it was great to be really on this panel with Mara and Sherilyn and Maeve. I think we're all inspired and influenced by each other. And I would just encourage folks to get involved with local, if you're not already involved, more feminist organizations. And, you can join our different coalitions if you're still. We have listservs and WhatsApp groups and all types of communication mediums. And and also if you're in the US, just keep an eye out for the Thrive Act and see how that plays out.
And I think that's for me, just a big thank you.
Good. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go ahead.
No, not at all. I'm just a huge thank you to everyone. And I think you said something earlier, Sherilyn, about the FemGND coalition in the US being farther ahead than you all, and just like a huge no to that. We're doing things, I think, in our spaces and in our places in all the ways that we can, and we're all doing our best. And I want you all to know as well, this will not be the last time we're in conversation together, I'm sure, but we learned so much from you all and really take inspiration from the work that you're doing. And so yeah, onward.
Yeah, absolutely. And I thought Frances made a really good point in saying that there's antecedents in these ideas, and the new, obviously there's a historical reason why we call it the new Green Deal, but a lot of this stuff is not new. And I would just encourage people to look at the work that scholars and activists have done to bring together feminism and environmentalism over the last 30 or 40 years in lots of places around the world. They go together. There's so many synergies between the goals of feminism and the goals of environmentalism. The fact that they sometimes don't speak to each other, to me, has always been very hard to understand. But there's a lot to learn, a lot to read, and a lot of really good work that's been done by economists, historians, philosophers, you name it, geographers, and maybe we could put together a reading list for people that goes beyond the policy stuff of today, but the kind of I can't think of a word, like the sort of the body of thinking over the years.
Yeah, I'm just really grateful to be here. I've really enjoyed the discussion. It's been absolutely fascinating to listen to you guys. And yeah, it's 9:30 and I'm exhausted. So I don't have anything articulate to say, but I've really found this a really valuable discussion. I'm very grateful to be invited and to have the opportunity to listen to you all.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you again for joining us, especially Sherilyn and Maeve. I know it is getting very late in the UK, but I appreciate you joining us for this conversation. Definitely, if you have any other resources you all want to pass along in the coming weeks, we'd be happy to send it out to our listserv. And I also just wanted to highlight, next week we have our final class, Winning Fossil Fuel Infrastructure Fights, with Nick Caleb and Ali Rosenblatt. So be sure to come back for that. And thank you all for joining us.